Welcome to CBH. Today we're going to talk about what happened to key Golden Age artists as the Silver Age was just around the corner. We tend to separate the ages by fan preference and genre. However, one strong factor is also a change in aesthetic in an industry when the old guard leaves and new people come in. Like we mentioned in the Atlas Implosion episode, Joe Manili and Matt Baker died in 1958 and 1959 respectively, leaving space for Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko to come in simply because there was a vacancy and the company needed talent to keep pumping out more comic books. However, not everyone dies, and as the golden age of superhero comic books was ending, tastes were changing away from superhero escapism to other genres, but also prominent comic book artists were leaving the field into what some at the time considered more honorable work. Comic books were not as lucrative as some jobs in advertising, magazine publishing, newspaper strips, and fine art. So let's review and find out what happened to some of the very best golden age artists that disappeared off the scene as the superhero comic book golden age came to an end. Now, Mac Raboy was an incredible golden age comic book artist who penciled some beautiful issues of The Green Llama and Captain Marvel Jr. His comic book work is truly enjoyable, and awesome illustrators like Neil Adams or Alex Ross look back at Raboy's work with an incredible fondness. Raboy was inspired by Alex Raymond's newspaper comic strip work on Flash Gordon, Secret Agent X9, and Jungle Jim, which has been highlighted in other episodes. His artist chops grew when working at the Harry Chesler comic book studio in the 1940s and became famous for his illustrious work on Bullet Man and Captain Marvel Jr. and bridged the transition between the two series through the villainous Captain Nazi. Raboy flowered his illustrated penciling style during the Captain Marvel Jr. run, and the rivalry between his teenage hero and his arch enemy Captain Nazi is nothing short of amazing. His art continued to impress when he penciled The Green Llama for Spark Publications in 1945. Fawcett started spreading Mac Raboy thin and using as many random images he would create in his comics line, even copying it to use over and over again, but it came to an end when Mac Raboy left comic books for the Flash Gordon newspaper Sunday strip in 1946. Mac Raboy worked on the Flash Gordon newspaper strip for more than 20 years until he died in 1967. His comic books are one of the telltale beauties of the golden age of superhero comic books, and lo and behold, he left it for a more glamorous and secure position, because that's how newspaper comic strips were looked at the time. Lou Fine was a fantastic superhero comic book artist who started in 1938, working for the Eisner and Alex comic book studio shop that put together comic book stories for publishers. His work shows up in various companies and under various names to give the audience a feel that there is a very large stable of excellent artists, which wasn't true. And he penciled one of the first radiation-powered superheroes, the Ray, who was augmented by cosmic radiation roughly 20 years before the Fantastic Four. His images were dazzling and heroic, but ultimately toward the end of World War II, Lou Fine left comic books in 1944 for advertising, making ads like this wholesome one for Nabisco shredded wheat. Jack Cole started in drawing for the Harry Chesler studio, the same one that Mac Raboy started in, drawing various comic books. He came into his own when Lev Gleason hired him to work on his comics line, where Cole created the Comet, the golden age precursor to X-Men Cyclops mentioned in a previous episode, and is also responsible for turning the yellow golden age Daredevil into the red one. Besides these Silver Age Marvel precursors came his crowning golden age comic book character achievement when he left Lev Gleason for Quality Comics and created and continued the adventures of Plastic Man from Police Comics 1 1941, which he worked on until the early 1950s. His images here are staggeringly entertaining, utilizing a cartoon approach and mixing it with both the crime and superhero genre, making an incredibly fun and visually stunning series of comic books. For the modern reader, Plastic Man was Deadpool before there was a Deadpool. Jack Cole worked on Plastic Man throughout part of the Atomic Age, or as some may call it, the later Golden Age, and jumped ship, leaving the comic book industry, and finally landed a girly cartooning gig for Hugh Hefner's Playboy magazine in 1954. When he left, it was yet another signifier that the industry would not be the same, that the Golden Age was truly over. Oddly enough, he died of a suicide in 1958. Now, known for his smooth lines, Daniel Barry met cartoonist George Mandel in 1941, who got Barry into the comic book industry. He did freelance work for comic books like Airboy, DC Comics, Westerns, helping to define the slick New York style that dominated the visual aesthetic in comics before the Jack Kirby 1960s Marvel era. In 1947 to 1948, he left comic books to work in the newspaper strip industry, first on the Tarzan dailies, and then was asked to work on the Flash Gordon daily strip in 1951 while Mac Raboy was still working on the Sundays. In 1967, when Mac Raboy died, Dan Barry took over the Sunday Flash Gordon strip, and his smooth line continued until 1990 when he retired. On to our next Golden Age star. When Will Eisner was in high school, he started at an early comic magazine under editor Jerry Iger in 1936, under the advice of a fellow student, Bob Kane, the co-creator of Batman. After a few issues of this comic book, Wow What a Magazine, he and Iger started their own comic book packaging business where they teamed up and pumped out comic books for publishers like Quality and Fox Comics. He created Wonder Man for Fox, which was sued out of existence for resembling Superman so much, which we discussed in the Superman newsstand episode. Eisner left comic books in 1940 and sold his part of the shop ownership to do the Spirit section of newspapers, which was meant to compete with comic books. So he leaves traditional comic books fairly early in the Golden Age. However, we still consider the comic book section of the newspapers as still being technically in a comic book format, and a key part of the various factors that establish what happens during the Golden Age of comic books. Eisner worked on the Spirit section until 1952, which toward the end of that era in 1951, he started work for the United States Military-Industrial Complex, who signed his checks making visual safety manuals for the Preventative Maintenance Monthly, which was yet another signifier that, again, the times were changing. These books did actually increase safety for the men and women serving abroad and domestically for the military. Eisner worked in the military, making these manuals for nearly 20 years, after which he then pioneered the modern graphic novel throughout the 1970s and beyond. Last but not least, Alex Schomburg worked on pulp magazine illustration until his foray into the golden age of comic books. Alex Schomburg's first science fiction cover was in 1939 for Better Publications' Startling Stories pulp magazine. His flair for golden age comic book covers got him top billing for fun and insane action covers for companies like Timely, Nedor Publishing, also known as Pines, as well as Temerson, also known as Continental. Alex Schomburg's covers are a real sight to see. They are insane and completely over the top, fun, rip-roaring action, sex appeal, Nazis, Japanese soldiers, explosions, weapons of mass destruction, etc. And when people saw an Alex Schomburg cover, to be sure, people were saying, "Wow, this is nuts. I'm buying this dang thing." Schomburg actually penciled roughly 500 to 600 of these covers. However, like the other glorious Golden Age comic book artists, all good things and this era of comics comes to an end, and he left comic books and spent the rest of his drawing career on covers and illustrations for science fiction magazines like the Winston Juvenile series that ran from 1952 to 1960, as well as others. Alex Schomburg had a long, fulfilling life and died at the age of 92. This has been a fun episode of CBH. The point of this presentation is to show that ages tend to be separated by what genre or art style is popular, but sometimes a large enough chunk of the change in aesthetic from one time to the next can occur because the artists, like those discussed today, simply just move on and work in another field. The nice thing about this type of work, though, is that they leave an incredible trail for new generations to discover, and their influence on the formative stage of the Golden Age is staggering. But keep that in mind when artists make retirement announcements. If enough of them do so, it might mean the tide is shifting and a new age may be around the corner. Don't forget to click on the subscribe button. We got more to say in other videos. Also check out our podcast, available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Google Play. We also have constant updates on Twitter and Instagram, or continue the conversation in our Facebook group. Cheers.